I hope you all had a nice refueling lunch. And welcome for this renewable session. We will have very nice, interesting talks about interaction in seabirds and renewables. So first, Lila Buckingham will introduce her talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello everybody, I'm Lila and I've just finished my PhD at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and the University of Liverpool. And today I'm going to be presenting on the final data chapter from my PhD. So we're currently facing a global energy crisis and many governments are turning to sources of renewable energy to kind of plug that gap. The UK, for example, have pledged to increase their offshore wind capacity to 50 gigawatts by 2030. With current capacity around 13 gigawatts, you can imagine that this is quite a lot of development that's going to be happening over the next few years. Unfortunately, although there's a lot of positives to renewable energy, they can have quite negative impacts on biodiversity, particularly seabirds. And this is important because seabirds are protected species in the UK and they are also globally threatened. So seabirds can be impacted by offshore wind farms in a variety of ways. The two main pathways are through direct collision, where they fly directly into a turbine and are killed. But they can also be impacted by displacement effects. So that might mean that they have to fly around a wind farm footprint, thus increasing the length and energetic cost of a journey. Or they can be prevented from accessing important foraging locations. And displacement effects are particularly understudied, but more so in the non-breeding season, which is also when seabirds generally experience their highest levels of mortality. So this is a really important time of the year to study these effects if we want to accurately assess the impacts of offshore wind farms on seabirds. So at the moment, current methods of assessment generally use distributional data that's derived from at-sea surveys, and this is a really good source of data. But unfortunately, it's really difficult to link these data back to the breeding population, and that's the level that seabirds are generally protected in the UK. So I tried to fill this data gap by using a multi-colony tracking study of the colonies that are shown here on the right to assess the population level vulnerability of two seabird species to displacement effects during the non-breeding season. And in doing so, I have developed a novel method of vulnerability assessment that could be applied to other seabird species, other study systems, and other marine threats such as fisheries or marine pollution, for example. So the key steps for this method were, firstly, I mapped bird densities throughout the non-breeding season. Secondly, I visualised areas of particularly high energetic expenditure, because this could indicate that these are locations where birds are more likely to be affected by displacement effects, by increased energetic expenditure or reduced food intake. Thirdly, I mapped the threat, so in this case, offshore wind farms. And finally, I overlapped these threat maps with the density and energetic expenditure maps to highlight key areas of vulnerability to displacement effects. And the two species that I used for this study were the common guillemot, shown here on the left, and the razorbill on the right. And both of these species are vulnerable to displacement effects from offshore wind farms. So at each of our breeding colonies, I deployed individuals with geolocation immersion loggers. So they're shown here on the right, on their own, and then on the leg of a common guillemot. And these devices are small and lightweight and can be deployed for multiple years, so we're really ideal for this non-breeding season study. And they gather locational data and activity data, such as whether the tag is immersed in salt water or not, and the temperature of the water if it is. And from these activity data, I derived activity budgets, so the amount of time that each individual spent in one of four behaviours. Firstly, their time spent foraging or diving, or time active on the water, so any time when the tag was completely immersed. Secondly, time spent inactive on the water. So in guillemots and razorbills, they generally rest at sea by withdrawing one of their legs into their plumage, so the tag is relatively dry. Thirdly, time spent flying, which is an energetically costly activity, particularly for guillemots. And finally, time spent attending the colony, which again is something that guillemots in particular do throughout much of the non-breeding season. And then I combined these four behaviours into a calculation to work out what their daily energetic expenditure was throughout the non-breeding season. So these are the locations where we tagged individuals, with guillemots on the left and razorbills on the middle and on the right. Each triangle depicts a breeding colony, and it's coloured by the name at the bottom. And we had slightly different colonies tagged for each species, just due to accessibility at the colony. And then for razorbills, we had slightly fewer tags that recorded activity data. So we only have 3 East Coast sites for the energetics side of that study, but very good coverage of Scotland for the density plots. So for each of these breeding colonies, I calculated the monthly distribution during the non-breeding season, so that's July to March in these species. And I also calculated their mean monthly daily energetic expenditure. And then in order to scale these data to the population size and assess the population level density and total energetic expenditure, I incorporated the untracked colonies that were near to a tracked colony. So within our tracked range, I calculated the maximum distance from an untracked colony to a tracked colony and limited our maximum distance from colony to that. So I didn't extrapolate to any colonies that were too far away from a tracked colony because we couldn't reliably say that such individuals would behave similarly to one of our tracked colonies. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some results. These figures show the tracked colonies in a white triangle, the untracked colonies that are included in our analysis in light grey circles, with guillemots on the left and razorbills on the right. So starting with the mean daily density, each of these figures is going to show the number of guillemots and razorbills that were present on average each day throughout the non-breeding season, with high densities shown in yellow and low densities shown in purple. So as you can see from these maps, there's really high area of density off the northeast coast of Scotland for both species. And also there were high density areas around the north coast of Scotland and the west coast of Scotland and extending into the central North Sea. And then these figures show the total energetic expenditure for the full non-breeding season. And again, you can see there's very high energetic expenditure off the northeast coast of Scotland for guillemots, and the west coast of Scotland and the central North Sea as well for that species. And then again, because we had slightly fewer colonies for razorbills, you can see that there's an area of high energetic expenditure off the northeast coast of Scotland and extending off the east coast of Scotland as well. So to put that into context with offshore wind farms, these maps show the current developed offshore wind farms in Scotland in the light grey polygons, and then the Scottish Sectoral Marine Plan from 2020 proposed areas are shown by the white polygon outlines. So when we overlap those proposed areas with the density plots, you can see that that area off the northeast coast of Scotland is potentially one of high vulnerability to displacement effects because it overlaps heavily with those proposed areas. And similarly, with regards to energetic expenditure, lots of these proposed sites overlap heavily with this area of energetic expenditure, high energetic expenditure. And that means that if that development were to go ahead, it could potentially reduce access of guillemots and razorbills to some of these really important foraging locations during the non-breeding season. And that could have impacts on guillemot and razorbill mortality and future population trajectories. So to summarise, I've highlighted a key area of vulnerability to displacement effects from offshore wind farms in adult common guillemots and razorbills for the majority of the UK breeding population. And in doing so, I have presented a novel method for assessing at-sea vulnerability to marine threats that I hope will be adopted for use in other seabird species and could be adapted to other threats as well. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to my supervisors, funders, and all of the very valuable field workers that contributed to data collection for this project, because I know many of you are here today. Thank you.
Do you have questions after this nice talk?
Hi, I was just wondering if you have or will be sharing your results with the authorities to inform marine spatial planning?
Yeah, definitely. That's the aim. The project was funded by some developers, and they're obviously really interested in the results. The developers have already had some of those, but as soon as we get the publication out, then we'll be sharing the data so it's open access and making sure that the statutory bodies also have access to that as well.
Hi, that was a really cool talk. I was just wondering, with that area of really high energy expenditure off the northeast of Scotland, have you got any idea what might be driving that? Like, is it driven more by increased foraging rates because there's less prey, or have you thought about what might be driving it?
Yeah, so the area of high energetic expenditure was quite similar to the area of high density. So I think, and energetic expenditure was quite similar throughout the year. There was some temporal variation in different months, but it wasn't huge. Numbers were different. So I think it's just because that's where there are a lot of birds, so they are, burning a lot of energy.
Yeah, okay, two things, I guess. First one is just that will this sharing of data maybe also be possible outside the UK? Because from a Danish point of view, those are essentially your birds that also go into the Danish parts of the North Sea, which are also being considered for wind farm development. So that was one thing. But the question is, this is looking at breeding birds. So the distribution of the pre-breeding age classes might be quite a bit different. Are there any thoughts of trying to do similar stuff for those birds?
Yeah, well, that is just a massive data gap, isn't it? It'd be great if we could tag some of those. I think there have been some trials of tagging younger birds, but at the moment we don't have any data for those. So definitely something that we'll be looking at in the future when tagging allows.
We still have time for one question? Yes? The timekeeper. Please, timekeeper. Yes, okay.
Thanks, Lila. I was just wondering whether you'd taken into consideration energetic requirements associated with the molt periods.
Yeah, so not directly. We did think about that, but we're not really quite sure how much energy they're burning from that molt period, or but we kind of estimated that because they do quite a lot of molting throughout the non-breeding season, so obviously they have a key period of vulnerability when they can't fly and when they're molting their primary feathers, but they are molting like head feathers and body feathers throughout like much of that non-breeding season. So in terms of the energetic expenditure of growing new feathers, we didn't think that was particularly relevant, but certainly if there were more data saying how much energy that costed, it could be something that we could bring in the future.
Actually, there are still time for last question. Do you have one? No. Sold. Thank you, Lila. So now we welcome Rob van Bemmelen.
Van Bemmelen.
Yeah, thank you. For the next talk.
Thanks. Hi everyone. So I'm Rob van Bemmelen. I work at Bureau Waardenburg, and we've been studying Sandwich Terns. Sandwich Terns are seabirds that are highly specialized on foraging on a few pelagic fish species, mainly herring and spread and sand eel species. And one of the interesting aspects of the species is that the size and the locations of colonies varies a lot from year to year. So colonies may appear or disappear from year to year. And also individuals show very low site fidelity. They're also a species of high conservation value. They're red listed in the Netherlands. They're often a flagship species for coastal restoration projects. But they're also considered to be vulnerable to the development of offshore wind farms, because they would avoid offshore wind farms. In the Netherlands, we have a program called the WOSE program, Wind at Sea Ecological Program, which is coordinated by the government. And within that project, several questions have been proposed to fill knowledge gaps. And in this presentation, I will discuss two of those questions. The first one is, what is the degree to which sandwich terns avoid entering wind farms? So what is their micro-scale avoidance rate? And the second one is, given this low site fidelity and these fluctuations in where sandwich terns breed, how does that affect the at-sea distribution? And how does that then affect the overlap with offshore wind farms from year to year on longer time scale than is normally considered. We used tracking data, GPS tracking data, collected from adults that were caught during the incubation phase. And we did that in several colonies. So in collaboration with the BTO, we tagged birds at Scald Head. Our colleagues at Wageningen Marine Research, Mark Leopold and Martin Baptist, tagged birds in Utopia and Wagiot, which is at Texel. And we at Bureau Waardenburg worked at the Slijkplaat and Schelo colonies, as well as the Putten and Grient. For the first question, so the quantification of the avoidance rate, we selected the data from the Putten and from Scald Head because the ranges of individuals from those colonies actually overlapped with existing wind farms. And we used step selection functions to do so. And I already have seen this mentioned in some presentations, but not really explained. So for those of you who are not familiar with step selection functions, it is more or less binomial model in which you compare positions that are actually used by the individual, which are shown here in this example in blue. You compare that with locations that are available to the individual but were not used at that specific time. And these availability locations, they are generated from the characteristics of the track, so from the distribution of turning angles and the distribution of step lengths. To do so, we had to regularize the data to 10-minute intervals. So this was constrained by, well, the resolution of our data, and we generated 50 available steps per used step. So this seems to be a bit of an overkill because most studies, they use much smaller numbers. But because the area of the wind farms is actually quite small compared to the entire range of individuals, you need a very high number of availability steps to get a bit of a, to get stable results, stable parameter estimates for the offshore wind farm effect. Within the models, we also included some covariates. So this is to the colony, water depth and sediment, and we already knew that these were important when we use a hidden Markov model to study where individuals start foraging, and this turned out to be largely driven by water depth and sediment. And then we included, and then we made two separate models, one in which we have had an offshore wind farm effect per colony. So this is one parameter for all 3 or 4 wind farms within the range of that colony. And we also had a model with one parameter for each offshore wind farm. You can imagine that if the layout of these wind farms is different, then also the response of individuals to those wind farms can differ. We included random intercept per step, so you're actually looking at the selection of habitat at each step, and random slopes for the offshore wind farm effect. And this allowed us to also get an estimate of the difference in response of individuals to offshore wind farms. So what did we find? For the models with only one parameter for all offshore wind farms, we found avoidance of 23% for the Putten and 16% of Scald Head, with, well, reasonable, credible intervals. But in the models with parameters for each offshore wind farm, we found that especially the offshore wind farms that are very far away from the colony, they were associated with much larger credit intervals. And also with quite a large range between these offshore wind farms. So, for example, in the blue dots, which are the wind farms near the Putten, the furthest wind farm is Eneco Luchterduinen, and that this was associated with a very high avoidance rate of 67%. So these plots show the distribution of individual avoidance rates based on these random slopes. And for the putter, we found actually a fairly low amount of variation. Most birds showed an avoidance rate between 0.2 and 0.3, while there was a bit more variation in scald head. And of course, it would be very interesting to link this to other individual parameters. But yeah, we don't have that data. So, okay, for the second question, so the annual overlap with offshore wind farms, we used all our tracking data. And we also collected annual colony counts for colonies around the southern North Sea, both for colonies with GPS tracking data, here in red, and colonies without GPS tracking data, here in blue. And we did that for the period from 2003 to 2020. And then we used a resource selection function to model the habitat selection. So in resource selection function, instead of generating availability positions per step, the availability positions are generated from the entire range that is available to the animals. So also so this shows the habitat selection at the scale of the entire study period. We included the same covariates again, and also colony level random intercepts and slopes, because all these colonies they differ quite a bit in what habitat is available close to the colony. So using these resource selection functions, we predicted densities, we scaled them per colony per year, and we multiplied that by the number of individuals that were breeding in that colony in that year. So this gives an estimate of the absolute distribution of individuals over the study period during any point in time, if all individuals would be out at sea. And this is an example of such a map for all colonies summed. And well, what you would expect and see, of course, is that highest densities are close to the largest colonies. And if you then calculate the overlap of offshore wind farms with the distribution of, well, the predicted distribution of sandwich terns, this also largely reflects the location and the size of colonies. So, for example, if we focus on North Holland, which is the left panel, we see the years on the x-axis and the number of individuals predicted to be in an offshore wind farm. The red lines are different offshore wind farms and individuals from a colony at the southern tip of Texel. And that colony had been occupied during the years in which these numbers peak. And then in 2015, breeding habitat was created much closer to these offshore wind farms. And that site was actually occupied by sandwich terns in 2016. And from then, the numbers have been increasing. So in summary, we found avoidance rates of about 20%. But these seems to be colony and offshore wind farm specific. Some of these estimates are also associated with quite large credible intervals, so they would benefit from more data. And the other one is that the overlap with offshore wind farms changes a lot from year to year and depends on the size and location of the colonies, of course. And this has not only implications for where you plan your offshore wind farms, but also where you create suitable breeding habitat for sandwich terns, which is something that is quite popular in the Netherlands. So actually a very new area, Waterdune in the south of the Netherlands, has been created a few years ago. And last year, 7,000 pairs of sandwich terns started to breed there. And this area is extremely close to a very large wind farm near the Belgian border. future studies. So I used step selection functions to estimate these avoidance rates. But in the literature, you can find several methods to actually do this. So it would be very valuable to compare these methods and discuss their merits. Also, it would be interesting to see at what distance birds start to avoid offshore wind farms. It's important to realize that these step selection functions, you need regularized data. So also the conclusions you draw from it, they are at the scale of this of your regularized data. So this avoidance rate is specific to 10-minute intervals in which birds normally fly about, 3 to 5 kilometers. We don't have good data yet on flight behavior within offshore wind farms, which would be necessary to quantify meso and microscale avoidance and flight heights. And of course, our data is only from incubating adults. So we're missing data on juveniles, immatures, non-breeding birds. So that was it. So thanks for your attention, and thanks to all the collaborators.
Thanks, that was really interesting. Do you have any feeling for whether individual level avoidance is influenced by the wind speed and the activity of the turbines?
No. No, we didn't. No, we didn't look at that. No, and but it would be possible, I guess, to include that in the model, if you. But it would require an interaction with offshore wind farm effect. Yeah. I'm not sure whether we actually have this data, but we can at least split it for wind speeds, I guess. So at low wind speeds, the turbines are not rotating at all. Yeah.
Just thinking about potential mechanisms of detection and whether they might be responding to turbulence or maybe infrasound. I'm thinking about Natasha's talk this morning, and maybe whether those things are related to the activity of the turbines.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah.
Maybe one more question?
In the back?
Yeah, in the back.
Thanks, great talk. Do you know what the factors are that drive these changes in the distribution of colonies? What causes them to wax and wane and move around?
No. Yeah, but I think this is really a complex behavior, because I guess it depends a lot on, for example, the presence of predators, the presence of the availability of food, of course, in that area, but it's also really a social process, I guess, in which you often have like a first bunch of birds that start to breed, and then often this colony grows and grows. So, so it's really complex, and I also have not really a clear idea how we could study that, because of the many factors that I think are important for establishment of a colony. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We run out of the time, so we'll welcome the next speaker. Thank you again. So the next speaker is Jude Lane, and we talk about the Gannet, which is great.
It is good. It's not all bad. Hi everyone. Yeah, my name's Jude Lane. I'm here from the RSPB, and I'm going to talk to you today about Gannet avoidance rates and how we can use tracking data to reduce error and uncertainty in avoidance rates during the breeding season. So, as we've already been told just earlier, the UK government has got an ambitious new target of generating up to 50 gigawatts from offshore wind by 2030, and it would like to see 5 gigawatts of that coming from floating turbines, which will be located in deeper seas further offshore. Now, northern gannets have been identified as one of the species that are potentially at greatest risk from offshore wind farm developments, and one of those particular risks is that of additional mortality caused by collision with turbines. And the reasons for this is because of the heights at which they fly, the distances that they travel, and the proximity of colonies to these developments. And the map there just shows, the scale of the developments that we're likely to see. So these are sites that are at some stage through the sort of consenting process. Some are already operational, others are just newly announced lease sites, but then the red stars highlight the majority of the gannet colonies within this area, so you can see just how close they are to them. So the way in which we can assess the potential mortality that might be caused by these developments to particular populations is to run collision risk models. The sort of industry standard, and one of them is called the band model, and it's a simple mechanistic model that's based on the probability of a bird occupying the same space as a turbine blade. And basically the parameters that go into this include those about the turbine's design and its operational details, but also those that are around the bird's size and the bird's behaviour. And through these parameters, we can predict the number of collisions that might occur across a given time period. The model's now been developed, which is great, and we now have a stochastic collision model, which allows for some of the errors and uncertainties in these parameters to be taken account for. And this is really important because these collision risk models have really high consequences for the environmental impact assessments and the development consenting decisions that are made as a result of this modelling. So it's really vital that we reduce the errors and uncertainties in these parameters as far as possible. So where do some of these errors and uncertainties lie? Well, many of them are associated with the parameters that are associated with birds' behaviour. And one of these is the avoidance rate. Quite simply put, it's basically a correction factor that accounts for the birds making some form of reactive behaviour in order to avoid colliding with a turbine. And on the face of it, it looks like quite a nice, simple equation. You just need the number of collisions that have been observed and then a prediction of the number of collisions that would occur in the absence of any avoidance behaviour. I'm not going to focus on observing collisions at sea in this talk. We all know that's clearly an incredibly difficult thing to do. And instead I'm going to focus on how we can improve our predictions of collisions that might occur. So in order to estimate predicted collisions, you need two parameters associated with a bird's behaviour, one of which is the flux rate, and the other is the probability of collision. And the flux rate is the number of birds that will be passing through the rotor-swept area of a turbine at a given time. So we have these two model parameters, but the input values that are needed to calculate these are all associated with the bird. So you need estimates of bird density, of bird's flight speed, and bird's flight height. But at the moment, the collision risk model and the avoidance rates that are used for gannets are derived from these input values that the data has been collected during the non-breeding season. And hopefully you'll understand by the end of the talk why that isn't ideal, and we need one dedicated to the breeding season. So we know that gannet behaviour differs between the breeding and non-breeding season. When they're rearing chicks, they're obviously central place foragers, so they're leaving the colony and returning multiple times, sometimes a day, and very constrained in their behaviour. But once the chick fledges, these birds are at sea, and some of them will migrate, and so it's very likely that their avoidance behaviour is going to change. They're going to have a different perception of threats, perhaps. And we also know that their behaviour within the breeding season changes. So it changes between incubation and chick rearing. And we know that also that weather variables can influence their behaviour as well. So certainly wind conditions can influence how they're behaving. And so if we end up misspecifying the bird parameters that are going into calculating the model parameters because we've used them from a different time of year or we've used from a different area, we're going to end up with incorrect model parameters. And as a result of this, we're going to get error and uncertainty in these avoidance rates. And previous work has shown that just a really small change in the avoidance rate can end up having quite a large or relatively large impact on the number of collisions at a single development site. And then if you multiply that up and start looking at cumulative mortalities across multiple development sites, which is clearly the case we're going to have, you can have quite a large impact on those just from that small change in the avoidance rate. So it's really important, going back to the environmental impact assessments and consenting processes, that we reduce this error and uncertainty as far as we possibly can. And one of those ways we can do that is to try and get better data and reduce the uncertainty in our use of flight speed and flight height that goes into those parameters. So the aim of this piece of work was basically to investigate the variation in flight height and speed of gannets that breed on the Bass Rock, and to do so within the footprints of the offshore wind farm sites closest to that colony. They're at various stages in the consenting and development process. We wanted to look at the variation in speed and height between different behaviours, different trip stages, between the sexes, and also under different wind conditions. So, as I mentioned, the data was all collected from the Bass Rock over a number of years between 2015 and 2021, with the omission of 2020. In total, we tagged 154 breeding adults. They all had I Got You GPS loggers that recorded location every 2 minutes. And in 2015 to 2017, as part of my PhD, we also deployed pressure loggers that allowed us to estimate flight heights on these birds, and hopefully you can just about make out the tags on the bird in the picture there. So when we looked at just the behaviour within these sites, so this is just looking at the GPS behaviour. From GPS data, we can derive simple behaviours of commuting, foraging, and resting on the water. Hopefully you can see that basically the vast majority of the time that these birds are within these footprints, they're in flight. So the blue and the purple locations there, they're in flight, and the green locations, they're resting on the water. And of that time in flight, over 3/4 of it, they're commuting, and just under 1/4 of the time they are foraging. We then looked at the flight in relation to the wind direction and found that the majority of the time they're flying with crosswinds, so the prevailing winds coming from the southwest, but they also spend 37% of the time with a headwind and 21% of the time with a tailwind. We then looked at flight speed within these areas. So on the left, you have a plot showing flight speed in relation to the trip stage. So outbound refers to between the colony and the furthest point of the trip, and inbound refers to that furthest point back into the colony. And we have both males and females shown on those plots. And on the right, you can see it with activity, so commuting and foraging behaviour. And the dotted line represents the average flight speed that's used for gannets within collision risk models, 14.9 metres per second. And so what we found was that there was no difference in flight speed between birds travelling out or coming back to the colony, but we did find that birds flew significantly faster whilst they were commuting than when they were actively foraging. But there was no difference between males and females, and there was no annual variation in this either. We also looked at spatial variation in flight speed. So these maps show all the flights, so both commuting and foraging during the outbound stage of the trip in relation to the different wind directions. So under all wind conditions, birds were flying faster with tailwinds, as you'd expect, and slower with headwinds. But under all different wind conditions, they were flying slower along the coast to the northeast, and also there's this sort of corridor from heading northeast from the colony, where under all wind conditions they are travelling faster than further due east of the colony. We also looked at height. So here you can see, again, we've got trip stage plot on the left and activities, whether foraging, commuting, on the right. And in this case, we have the dotted line highlights what would be potentially the lowest sweep of the wind turbine blade, so 30 metres above sea level. So what we found was birds were flying higher on their outbound stage of the trip than when they were returning. And there was also an indication that birds were flying higher during when they were actively foraging than when they were commuting, which is something that's been found before. But again, no difference between males and females, and no annual variation in this. So to sort of conclude, what we found is that indeed within these sort of small discrete areas of the wind farm footprints, gannets had quite a lot of variation in their flight speed and height. And when we go back to looking at those, the impacts and implications for those model parameters, we found that sex had no bearing on the input values, but we did find that behaviour had an impact on flight speed and flight height. Wind direction had an impact on flight speed, and trip stage had an impact on flight height. And so what we would advocate for is that we certainly need further research to look at behavioural differences throughout the breeding season. So this work was all focused on the chick rearing period. As has been said earlier, there's very little known about incubation and pre-incubation, and even sort of the pre-migration period. Because all this variability in speed and height is definitely going to impact the differential risk of collision, and should be therefore reflected in a breeding season specific avoidance rate. So we've made a little start on this. This data was obviously quite low resolution, but we have put out just in April this year loggers recording at 1 second within those footprint areas to hopefully give us better predictions and more accurate measures of behaviour and how they're behaving in those areas. So hopefully we can end up with better informed consenting decisions for these developments. Just like to say thank you. Obviously, it was a huge team effort with all this data collection and analysis, so thank you to all these people and more, and for the funders, and that's me.
We have time for one or two questions. Quick question. One question.
Thank you for that. Is there any indication that birds learn to do things, individuals learn to do things differently as a result of these turbines as they go through life? Do they change their behaviour in relation to them? Or are they doing what they want to do and the turbines are just there all the time? Is there a learning behaviour?
This is going to be really interesting to look at as these turbines come into operation. So essentially at the moment, the case we have with the Firth of Forth developments is we haven't got any operational at the moment. And so we've got this, we're lucky in that we have this quite a big data set of behavioural information before the turbines were constructed. And now as they start to come online, we're really going to be able to investigate how their behaviour changes and in what way. So yeah, it would be amazing to see how this progresses. We're lucky with our study site that we have got the opportunity to learn this, but we don't know it at the moment. So yeah, watch this space, I think.
One last question. No more question? Oh, yes.
I was just wondering, is there any indication that changes in visibility could impact these models?
I think that's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I've previously tried to look at the influence of like rainfall, because potentially that could influence, and not in relation to foraging to turbines, but just in relation to foraging. And wasn't actually able to find any relationship. But I think as these turbines come online, and we have got such a good data set of environmental variables that we can use now, I think all this sort of thing is going to be so interesting to look at with the high resolution data to see how day-to-day variability in wind and weather conditions in general, not just wind, change. I think that's going to be really fascinating to look at.
Thank you very much. So we have now 2 short communications. So the next speaker will be Zoe Deakin. So for 5 minutes.
Hello. So the Scottish Government contracted the RSPB to track leeches and European storm-petrels from their major colonies on the west coast of Scotland, both during the breeding season and on migration. So last summer, Mark Bolton, that's gone crazy. Mark Bolton and Connie Tremlett deployed 15 GPS loggers on leeches, storm-petrels on St Kilda. And they retrieved all of those birds within 2 to 12 days. And this gave us 23 complete trips for 13 birds. And that is the first tracking of that species in the UK. I'm sure Mark was much less shaky in real life. So incubating birds were at sea for on average 62 hours, so 2 to 3 days, and chick-rearing birds about 2 days. And they all travelled to an area to the north and west of St Kilda, up to about 300 kilometres from the colony during incubation and about 260 during chick rearing. Their total trip distances were just over 1,000 kilometres during incubation and just over 800 during chick rearing. And as you can see, they're mainly using an area of deep water, so the dark blue area is water more than 1,000 metres deep, and they tended to follow the edge of the continental slope. And a large part of the area used by the birds is designated as a nature conservation MPA for a lot of benthic species, so from cold water corals to gulper sharks. And so it's obviously important for a diverse range of marine taxa. Meanwhile, on the Treshnish Isles, Saskia and Darren were deploying geolocators and GPS devices on European storm-petrels. So they put out 23 GPS devices and retrieved 19. And that gave us 26 complete trips, 6 during incubation, 8 during brooding, and 12 during chick rearing. And there are some clear differences from the leeches tracks. So although incubating European storm-petrels spent similar amounts of time at sea, so again 2 to 3 days, they stayed much closer to the colony, so within about 140 kilometres, and had much shorter trip distances in total, about 550 kilometres. And then chick-rearing birds, which will hopefully play, there we go, were at sea for about a day, and they all stayed within about 100 kilometres of the colony, with trip distances of about 300 kilometres. And all the birds stayed within the relatively shallow waters of the continental shelf, with just one bird venturing to the shelf edge. Finally, we looked at the overlap of the European storm-petrels with this area, which has got a lease option agreement in place as part of the ScotWind leasing round for offshore wind farm development. And we found that 7 of the 19 tracked birds had locations within this area. We had planned to return to both St Kilda and Treshnish this summer to retrieve the 20 geolocators that were deployed on each species and to do some more GPS tracking. But like a lot of field work, it was unfortunately cancelled due to avian flu. So we're currently seeking funding to continue the work next year. Thank you.
Any question? No? No question? Oh, yes. In the back.
It was whether there was any obvious features that are 100 k's from the second colony and 200 k's from the first colony that they are targeting, shelf edges or some such.
So for St Kilda, we already knew from sort of boat surveys that they're around the Rosemary Bank seamount, so they tend to target this particular seamount. And then Treshnish, nothing obvious, I don't think. And that is just the first year of tracking from those colonies. So in Shetland, they do tend to use slightly different areas in different years as well. So.
One more question? Okay, I just have one. What do we know about the Storm-petrels regarding the interaction with the wind farms, regarding the sensitivity to avoidance or collision?
Yeah, so we've actually just done another project for Marine Scotland looking at the potential impacts of offshore wind on these species. And although we know, or we think we know, that storm-petrels tend to fly very close to the water, so they're not necessarily at risk of collision, they are attracted to artificial light. So the big concern and the big unknown at the moment is whether they are going to be attracted up by the safety and navigation lights on the turbines, which could bring them into that rotor-swept area.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, and the last speaker for this session will be Alexandra Dodd. Talking about LiDAR and how to measure the flight height.
I'm Alex. I work for APEM. I started using LiDAR for measuring flight heights in the offshore environment. So why do we need flight heights? I'm sure lots of people have mentioned them already today. For European environmental impact assessments, they expect the collision risk of a wind farm development to be assessed, and to do that, you need accurate avian flight heights. Ideally, this is on site-specific flight heights as opposed to generic ones from the literature. Previously, flight heights have been estimated from boat-based surveys, digital aerial surveys, and general literature informed by tagging studies. Each of these methods have their own issues with them, and we wanted to investigate whether LiDAR would give us a method which would be more accurate and based on a measurement as opposed to a model or an estimation. So LiDAR is light detecting and ranging. So a series of light pulses are fired out and then reflected back to a sensor once they hit an object. And from that you can make 3D representations of what you are surveying. I've lost my place. So we wanted to see if combining this LiDAR system with our digital aerial surveys and our still imagery that we're already collecting would be a good combination of getting accurate species-specific flight heights. And combining our digital still imagery with LiDAR system, it's possible to match the data sets in order to determine what is a bird and what's not a bird, and to get species-specific identification as well as an accurate flight height. Noise has been identified as an issue with LiDAR in the past. Sometimes the light pulses hit large insects or sea spray, and that's also reflected back to the sensor. But our system is calibrated so that when we get a cluster of points, such as this one, we can look at it alongside our digital still imagery and match up the points to what we can see. With the LiDAR, we can produce these 3D representations of what was captured on the survey, which is a massive difference from just a dot on a 2D image of the open ocean, especially for pre-construction things. So these are all the same group of gannets in all of these images. We did a trial of using this in North Wales in 2019, primarily looking at if it could be used on terns, mainly sandwich terns. So these are our results, with the number of individuals of each species up the side and the amount of LiDAR hits each individual was getting along the bottom. The more hits, the better for repeatability, and obviously larger species such as gannets will get more hits than, say, a storm-petrel. But even with the smaller species, we were still getting really good returns. With only one hit, we still have an accurate measurement of the flight height, and it's predicted that the accuracy of the LiDAR is on average around 0.5 meter, but it can be up to 10 centimeters. And before all of our survey flights, the LiDAR system is sent over an area along the coast with known heights of things, so it can be calibrated and checked that it's working accurately. And this method provides us with a much higher number of samples than with the size-based trigonometry method to get flight heights out of digital still imagery. Oh, too far. We currently have active projects using this LiDAR technology, including surveying operational wind farms and working with regulators, including Marine Scotland, to further develop this and what they would want to see out of it. We're also investigating how different flight heights of a bird, the speed of a bird, and if the bird is banking or diving can impact on the number of LiDAR hits, because that's a potential issue with doing them from the digital still imagery. If the bird is not in the correct orientation, which birds being birds don't do what you want them to, then it's difficult to get the exact measurement, whereas so LiDAR, it can be more accurate in that situation. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Some question? Yes, here in the back.
Hiya. Are you proposing to have the camera and the LiDAR on the same plane?
Yeah, we have the systems integrated together, so when we use it in surveying, they are within the same rig system underneath the plane.
Okay, thanks.
There was another question here.
Hi. I was just wondering, from your case study, did you compare your flight height curve for Sandwich Tern with the kind of established modelled flight height distribution from the Johnston et al. Paper that we all used?
I imagine so. I don't know it in depth, but yeah, and it would have also been assessed alongside our standard sort of trigonometry size-based flight height method from the imagery alone as well.
And do you know how it compared to both of those things?
Not off the top of my head, but I can get it back to you.
Okay, thanks.
A very last question?
Thank you. I was just wondering about the practicality of using LiDAR in two respects. One is the overall cost of that approach, and two is the restrictions under which you can use LiDAR in terms of weather, for example.
Yes, so it is a more expensive way to do it, just because the system itself is more expensive. So that's why it's not being adopted as quickly as some of the digital stuff. But in terms of the conditions that we can use it in, things like low cloud and mist, not so much, because the light is kind of scattered and stuff and isn't as clear to get through to a target. And as much as a digital aerial survey, having flat calm seas would be brilliant, because you can see further into the water. LiDAR, you need a little bit of texture at least on the surface so that you're mapping the sea at the same time as the bird, and it's not losing all of the light into just a flat surface.
So you can't use it then when it's cloudy or foggy?
You can use it in certain cloud levels, but once it gets too low and too dense, then you can't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will close this session, and now there is Equality, Diversity and Inclusion event proposed by Avril, Hutch.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to meet you and welcome to Cork. And thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. So I am not an ornithologist. I know very little about marine ornithology, but I'm here to talk to you today about EDI. I may be raising a future ornithologist. During the summer, we visited the Birds of Prey exhibition in County Clare, and ever since, my son thinks he's an owl. So if you have any tips, let me know. So I'm going to talk broadly about application of EDI, not just in this particular area, but the general principles apply irrespective of discipline. And I suppose one thing I wanted to show you is when people talk about EDI, they think it's immense. They don't know where to start. And these two slides are a beginning point. So the first is the standard UCC slide that is used across the institution. What do you see here? So you have a group of male students, you have a group of what could be called lovely girls in their gowns, and you have a male active participant in research. So there's quite a bit missing. If you were to change it, you could have mixed groups, mixed races, mixed ethnicities, mixed abilities, and people who are active in different roles. It's a very simple fix, but when we're using this slide deck and we're presenting to a student group that is diverse, they want to see themselves on our slides. So that very first impression that you make at the beginning of a presentation, that's setting the tone for everything else that you're going to talk about. So small changes are really important. My background is a little bit different. So I spent the last 15 years working in human rights and equality across Southeast Asia and Africa. And then I came back and I worked for the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and on Irish Aid projects here. One of the projects that I would have been involved in was based on gender equality in surgery. There's a lot of similarities between surgeons and ornithologists. I don't know if you know that. But I suppose in terms of the work that needed to be done, medical students, on average in Ireland, 52% of medical graduates at undergraduate level are female. By the time you get to consultant surgeons, it's 9%. So there's a huge drop-off in the pipeline, and why does that happen? It happens because the environment is not supportive, and it happens because the opportunities and opportunity of outcome is not there for female students. We don't have the data for ethnic minority or students with disabilities, but it's very interesting to see what can happen when you implement positive action measures. So in 2014, the Royal College of Surgeons put together an action plan to address this issue. And they set 15 very strong targets. They seemed overly ambitious at the time, but they managed to get the people who were progressing from undergraduate medicine to the core surgical training program from 8% female to 40% female in the space of 4 years. So that was done simply by positive action measures, not quotas, simply information that made the, I suppose, application process, the systems within the hospitals more inclusive. The other thing they did was they amplified things like role models. So when you walk through the corridors of the Royal College of Surgeons, every portrait on the wall was a man. And that's because every president had been a man. But around that period, they did elect their first female president, and that set a change in terms of representation. And in the main boardroom that looks out over Stephen's Green, they had, a room with 16 very famous portraits, and they made a decision to take half of those and replace them with female role models. And this was very important because the students began to see themselves, the female students. And we wondered how our male colleagues might receive this, but they were really supportive because a lot of them had daughters who'd gone into surgery, or sisters or friends, and they knew that their experiences were very challenging. So on graduation day, it's fantastic now. The students go up, they stand in front of these portraits. That's where they want to be photographed. And of these 8 women, some of them, all we had was a signature on the day they graduated. And we found out that they went to Africa and India, and they worked in hospitals all over the world. They led vaccination programs. They did incredible work, but they were unknown. And the other thing that happened was there was more research in the area because we didn't know what the impact of having more female surgeons would be. And in the last 2 years, a huge study in Canada of patient outcomes, 1.3 million patients, showed that if you have a female surgeon on your surgical team, you're more likely to have a positive outcome for your patient. It also stated that if you have a male surgeon and it's his birthday, never let him operate on you. So this, I suppose, data set is very important. And we've all learned a lot today in terms of why data is important for ornithology. But data for your discipline and your cohort is equally important. We didn't have this for surgery. I think we're probably in the early days for ornithology, but I'm trying to show you what can happen in the space of 8 years. So we now have an increase in the number of surgical trainees, we have representation, we have better patient outcomes, and the next female of the College of Surgeons is female, and so is the one after that. So I'm talking specifically about gender equality, but we are going to talk about equality more broadly. And in terms of ornithology, I suppose the story is well versed. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. In the 19th century, women became involved in ornithology through the bird welfare movement, and a lot of the plumage that was worn on hats and on garments at that time, I suppose, became collector's items, but the treatment of the birds that were used in them was quite poor. Some of the, I suppose, key leaders at that time were Susan Fenimore Cooper, who's the first person to write a book, a female to write a book about nature that's, I suppose, well received. And then Florence Merriman Bailey, who has published thousands of articles, but is also very famous because initially she used to use her opera glasses to go bird watching and use them as her binoculars. And then Fanny Hardy Eckstorm, her father was a taxidermist, and that's how she became involved. But she's also one of the key environmentalists, and a lot of the work that's happening now about addressing the biodiversity crisis, she would have started. So the reason I'm showing you these ladies is that a lot of the, I suppose, work around role models and trailblazers needs to be celebrated as part of the work you're doing, but you shouldn't have to go back to the 19th century. And it's great to see, I suppose, quite a balanced representation here today. But a lot of the, I suppose, women's work, as it might have been called in ornithology, was unrecognised. So a lot of the drawings and things like that that male ornithologists would have done, the colourists were women, and those women were unnamed, they were never credited, and a lot of the money that was generated from selling the images of birds were done by female colourists. So there's a whole piece of work there and a story to be told that I think is really interesting. In terms of, I suppose, a modern-day study, you're probably familiar with this, but a recent article about female birdsong shows us that once you have more female ornithologists, we become more, I suppose, understanding of, the types of song that birds are singing, particularly female birds. There's a QR code here. If you scan your phone on it, you'll be able to read the full article, but I won't go into it in too much detail here. So we've, I suppose, heard studies today. I'm quite worried after what I've seen in the last hour. I didn't know any of this. So the poor birds. But the group that I'm studying, and Lila has helped us study, is you. So you are the cohort study for this. And in terms of the N numbers, so we had 101 responses to the survey. And in terms of age, it's pretty balanced. It is quite interesting that there's quite a lot of young ornithologists who completed this survey, and it's really, I suppose, encouraging to see that there is this breadth in terms of this demographic. In terms of ethnicity, the categorization here is a little bit different to what we would typically use. It is a very white cohort, and I must say I did try to find examples of minority groups that are involved in ornithology. It is quite limited, and I suppose there is quite a lot of work to do there. In terms of religion, we have a lot of atheists or agnostics in the bird community, much higher than the average population, but anyway. And in terms of gender, so those that identify as male and female, we do have a slightly higher proportion of male respondents here, which I think would be reflective of the broader population of ornithologists or seabird ornithologists. I suppose what's interesting is when we ask about gender identity, so how people identify either as trans or another, I suppose, gender and non-conforming characteristic. We had a couple of people who prefer not to say. And I suppose this is something that's become quite prominent in discussions around academia and making sure that we have the right categorization around this when we are collecting data. In terms of sexual orientation, so we do have, I suppose, a number of people who identify as bisexual, gay, or lesbian. And in terms of where they're comfortable disclosing that, just over half are happy talking about that or sharing that information at work. In terms of disability, it was quite interesting that 30.4% identified as having a disability. This would be significantly higher than the average population. So it's quite striking, but it may also mean that in terms of positive action measures and how you support persons with disabilities, that you may need to think about additional things that you can do to support that community. And again, in terms of where people are happy disclosing it, about half, again, are happy sharing that at work. In terms of general questions that were asked, I believe the seabirding community is a safe space for all people. So it's on a Likert scale. 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. So the vast majority said that they would agree with this. Again, the tend not to agree or disagree would be it's a little bit higher than we might like, but that shows that there's some work to be done. I feel a sense of belonging within the seabird group and the seabirding community. Again, the numbers are slightly higher here. Belonging is a very integral part of EDI, and we'll talk about it in more detail in a minute. But if you achieve a sense of belonging, that's the kind of ultimate, implementation of EDI in an effective way. I feel comfortable discussing my background, beliefs, and cultural experiences with other people in the seabirding group. Again, I suppose the disagree, somewhat disagree, and don't agree or disagree could be lower. So maybe there's a little bit more work to do there. And then people of all culture and backgrounds are valued within the seabirding community. And again, the majority are supportive, but again, a little bit more to do. People within the seabirding community are respectful of one another. Again, similar enough numbers, slightly higher with the somewhat agree. And then we asked people what do they think we could do to improve. So there's an acknowledgement that the seabird group has already done quite a bit in terms of newsletters and awareness raising campaigns, training grants, appointing an EDI officer, and I suppose having an EDI statement and things like that. In terms of opportunities for the future, I suppose there was a lot of emphasis on wanting EDI training. People want to understand this. And then there's also, I suppose, looking at the academic elements to ensure that how conferences are run, how committees function, all those things are EDI proofed. And then there's, I suppose, examples of small gestures of inclusion or maybe the things that I talked about at the beginning, like the slide deck and things like that. So to do all those things, we need to understand what EDI is and why does it matter to you. EDI matters to everybody, and there is, I suppose, some exceptionalism in terms of how people think about it. People often assume that it's not about them, it's about the minority group, it's about, someone who's maybe not as privileged as them, but we all have responsibility for EDI. It's equality for all. We can only do that if we all hold ourselves to account. And we've seen that over the last number of years in particular. We've seen it with various, I suppose, events like Black Lives Matter. We've seen it with the impact of climate change and the biodiversity crisis that we're all facing. We've seen it with COVID and the technological revolution that we're all experiencing, particularly the advances around AI and what that means for EDI. And unfortunately, we've seen it most recently with war. So we have to, I suppose, understand what our responsibility is, but we can only address these crises if we're able to come together as a community. And I suppose COVID is a very good example of how we did that well and how we did it quite quickly relative to what the challenge was. So I'd ask you to keep those, I suppose, big matters in the back of your mind as we progress. All EDI work and human rights work is framed in a legislative context. So whether it's European law, UK law, Irish law, wherever you might be from, it is defined in the law of your country. All of your countries have made a commitment to the SDGs, and the majority are committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there is a basis for all of this work, and then there's a number of other ones that are specific to the Irish context here. Within Ireland, when I'm talking about EDI, I like to refer to this definition because it can be quite all-consuming, but this is understandable to everybody. So what are the dimensions of equality or inequality? that impact the well-being or the quality of life of everyone. Respect and recognition, resources, power, working and learning, and the last one, which most people forget, is love, care, and solidarity. Without these 5 things, a community cannot function. So if you remember anything today, remember this definition, and it's much easier to apply it in terms of application and how we advance EDI. I'm assuming everyone understands what equality is, but just in case, equality is about relationships between individuals and groups, and it's a basic notion that all human beings are entitled to a minimum standard of treatment. As I said, it's grounded in law and policy, and it's not about sameness. If you take anything away, equality is not about sameness. You also need to understand the difference between equality and equity. So equality is about dignity and respect, and it's about ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to make the most of their lives and talents. It's not always about treating everyone the same. So we talk a lot about equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Equality of outcome is what's preferable. It's what we're doing to get there, and that's where we talk about equity. So equity is what we do, I suppose, to make things fair, and it's how you get to equality. So that's, I suppose, a simple definition. This is a very famous image. It's used across every EDI presentation I've ever seen. But it's very interesting if you scan the article and understand what this image is actually about. So it's by Craig Frawell. And this is, I suppose, trying to understand the difference between equality and equity. And you can see what they've done to solve the solution, but this is not a perfect image. This is much better. So in the first one, you can see the treatment is equivalent. In the second one, you can see that there's equitable treatment. But the last one is what you want to achieve. You want the systematic barrier to be removed completely. Another term that you should be familiar with is intersectionality. And this is a term coined by a French feminist called Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s. And this is the complex cumulative way that multiple forms of discrimination overlap. And I suppose it's the experience of marginalized groups and identities. No one type of identity exists in isolation. We're all more than one thing. So you may be female, you may be a lesbian, you may be black. You can be all those things, and then you may face multiple layers of discrimination as a result. We also have to be cognizant of our privilege. So privilege is, I suppose, something that we're all aware of, but we may not fully understand what it means, because the majority of us in this room are privileged. We're immensely privileged. But that's not to say we don't have challenges in our life. And I suppose we have to be quite careful in balancing and nuancing that language. So privilege is granted to people who are, I suppose, members of social identity groups, including white people, able-bodied people, heterosexuals, males, Christians, middle or owning class people, middle-aged people, and English-speaking people. And typically, if you have privilege, it's invisible to you. You then, I suppose, become a dominant group, and that means that you can be responsible inadvertently or intentionally for oppression. And the different examples of this type of oppression, which is when you have a combination of prejudice and institutional power, are things that you'll be familiar with: racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, etc. And these, I suppose, intersecting groups of privilege and oppression is most easily understood here. So there's rafts of literature on this, but if you have this graph, this is sufficient for you to understand that the wheel, I suppose, is multi-layered, and that there's different facets of the different types of privilege and oppression that intersectionality means. In terms of creating belonging, so I mentioned this earlier, so if you effectively implement equality, diversity, inclusion in your organization, you create a sense of belonging. And that's where every individual reaches their full potential, and that's what you're aiming to achieve. I like to refer to Lynn Shore's framework for belonging. You want to be in the top right quadrant here, where there's high belongingness. And I suppose it's very, in terms of the technical aspects of your work, it's nice to have a framework like this. It makes it less abstract. And I would encourage you to read a little bit more about this in terms of your work. There's a lot of literature around EDI that may not appear to be related to it, but in terms of different approaches that are relevant. So we've talked about intersectionality. Another element is compassionate kindness. And this is a term coined by professors Christopher Germer and Kristen Neff in the States. And I suppose it's become really, well used as a term during the pandemic because there's a recognition that we're all flawed as individuals, and as soon as we recognize that, it's much easier to create relationships and sustain them. In terms of psychological safety, you'll all be very familiar with safe spaces. This is very important in academic settings, but psychological safety is a little bit different because it applies specifically to a work context. And this was coined by Amy Edmondson in the early 90s. There's some really good books on this, but if you can have difficult conversations in a safe space with positive outcomes, then you have created a sense of psychological safety. Within the university context, we talk a lot about staff-student partnership. There needs to be equality in terms of that relationship. And again, in the academic settings that some of you come from, that's going to be really important. And then the last one is emotional and cultural intelligence, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. A recent book by Ruchika Tulshran is called Inclusion on Purpose. There are many, many books on this topic. This one is probably one of the best of the recent publications, but she uses this bridge term, and again, it's simplifying a very complex concept. And I suppose one thing that is important to acknowledge, that having discussions around EDI make people uncomfortable. And you have to be able to sit with that discomfort to be able to bring about change. And when you learn from it, then good things come, but you have to go on that journey. So what is that journey, and what are some of the actions that you can take? In terms of identity and culture, you need to be able to reflect and think about who you are as an organization and who you are as individuals. What is your lived experience? What's the culture within this organization? What are the values, and are they clearly defined and lived? As I said, is there psychological safety? How do we perceive ourselves, and how do others perceive us? I'm an outsider. You seem like a lovely bunch of people, but it's always good to get, that external feedback. And do you have a statement on EDI and accessibility? So it's quite interesting in terms of what's out there in terms of good practice examples. So I know that Cornell and the British ornithological main group, I can't remember the name, but they're the only two I could find that have a diversity statement. And I suppose there's a bit more work to do. It's standard practice now to have this in an organization in the same way that you have HR procedures and things like that. But it is very important. And I suppose the risk of not having it is you become outdated and you become irrelevant, because young students, particularly when we're in a university setting, they look to see how organizations are doing this, and they will make their selection on their career, where they work, where they study, based on what the commitment to EDI is. It's really fundamental in that decision-making process. And then the last piece, which you'll all be experts in, is data. And how we collect data and how we implement processes. And if you can have the rigor that you have for ornithology with how you collect data around ornithologists, then you'll be able to go a long way in terms of tracking your progress and measuring change. Obviously, you'll be familiar with the Seabird Group EDI action plan. I won't go into it in detail here, but I did just want to highlight it because there is a commitment to 5 key objectives. And I hope that you're all working together to implement those. Good practice examples are things that we can do. We've talked about a little bit, but I'll share the slide deck after if you want to go through some of that, and I can answer some questions. In terms of training, there's great, I suppose, diversity in terms of training that is available. I did just want to flag briefly that unconscious bias training is somewhat problematic. And a lot of the research shows that it has limited impact. So if you are planning to implement a training regime, I would strongly recommend that you focus on some of the other trainings. Implicit bias is part of every human. It's what we do. So I think it's important that that element is woven in across all the trainings, but I did just want to mention that point. Policy and monitoring is also important. So public sector duty exists in Ireland and the UK, and that's a great grounding point for this work. And then you can EDI proof your policies and look at good practice examples of accountability and measurement, like the Athena Swan accreditation system, which you'll be familiar with if you're based in any Irish or UK or Australian universities. Perhaps somebody could set up a similar accreditation system for ornithology. There's lots of opportunities, lots of individual disciplines, engineering, surgery, they've all gone that way. They've all set up a kind of a gold standard of where they want to get to. I don't know if that exists yet in ornithology, but there's a goal for you. In terms of, I suppose, things that we've done here in UCC, so I mentioned Athena Swan. So we have over 10 awards here now for individual departments, thanks to the great work of colleagues here. We have been a University of Sanctuary for the last number of years, and we support scholarships for students coming from conflict countries all over the world. We have the longest standing LGBT staff and student network in an Irish university, and you'll see the Rainbow Walkway here that was unveiled last year. We also have an anonymous reporting tool where people can report discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment and violence. And this is a game changer in terms of people who maybe don't want to go through formal reporting systems, but it is very important to give people that opportunity to share, because it's only that way that you can make the relevant education and policy interventions that might help address it. We also have a bystander intervention program, which is excellent here in UCC, and that helps address sexual harassment and violence and how to have those difficult conversations. And this year we've also launched a plastic-free Periods for All product across the institution. So I'll leave it there, but if you have any specific questions, I'm very happy to take them. I'm conscious of the time, but thank you for your attention and for listening, and I wish you the best of luck with your EDI work.
So I think Avril will be available in the coffee session as well. You can ask her any questions more confidentially. But you can also come and talk to me. I'm the EDI rep for the Seabird Group, and I'll be around for the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much for your presentation. This issue was addressed 2,000 years ago, and the answer is in 3 words: love thy neighbour.
I was interested in your comment about unconscious bias training. I'm involved in another ornithological charity, not this one, where all trustees and committee members have to take it annually as part of their commitment. But you said that there were issues with it, and I wondered whether you could elaborate. Is that a generic issue across the board, or are there good and bad training options in that area?
No, so the literature in the last number of years, I suppose, has tracked the impact of unconscious bias training over a 15 to 20 year period, and the outcomes are limited because, I suppose, the understanding of the difference between unconscious and implicit bias isn't clear. Implicit bias training is important, and I think that's central to mainline EDI training, but the data shows us that actually, from an unconscious bias standpoint, doesn't work. So a lot of the organizations, particularly in the States, after Black Lives Matter, that brought it in for that reason, have now started phasing it out and moving toward generalized EDI training. So there's lots of recent publications that I'm very happy to share with you on that.
Oh, thank you. That's a fascinating talk. Universities are quite often reluctant to spend money on this sort of thing, and you've clearly had a lot of success at UCC. What would you say were the key things that have persuaded UCC to invest in EDI?
I think in the Irish higher education sector generally, the advent of Athena Swan was absolutely a game changer, because the three main research bodies in Ireland refused to give research funding unless you had Athena Swan accreditation. And it's unfortunate that that was the motivation that was needed, but it did change things significantly. So at the time Athena Swan was implemented in Ireland, we had never had a female president of an Irish university, and now we have 3. And that's really important, I suppose, in terms of role modelling and things like that. Within, I suppose, this institution, the support of the leadership is critical. It has to come from the top. A lot of EDI work is grassroots based, but if your president or your registrar or the leadership team aren't supportive of the agenda, it's very hard to advance it. The other thing is that, I suppose, as I mentioned, the student population drive a lot of this work. So you'll be familiar with the student-led activities that the Sustainability Forum have done here in UCC. And our student union, but the wider student body, are demanding this of us. And also from a staff perspective, people want to be proud of where they work. They want to be happy at work. So it's not really a difficult sell in terms of why we need to do this. It impacts every element of your life at work, because it impacts relationships, environments, systems, everything within the institution. So I think that evolution in thought of EDI just being about gender equality to it being about everything and how an institution functions and how we all belong is what changes the approach and why people see it's more important.
I got a question about the careers of women in the research in academia in general, which is not just only in ecology, but how could we address the fact that actually when you have a child or 2 children, it's the impact is absolutely huge on the career of women, and it's just not, small false things that could change that, and it's also associated to society in general and not only the workplace.
So there's a couple of good practice examples. So a couple of research bodies now in Ireland will fund maternity leave, and that's going to be really important. All of them should be funding maternity leave. But in terms of engagement with PIs and opportunities to advance, we know that that's a critical period for a woman to take time out of her career. And one of the things that has been proven to change that is if you can increase the number of men who take paternity and parental leave, because that is, I suppose, a game changer in terms of how those conversations go and the acceptance level around it. But also, I suppose, the opportunities for people when they come back in terms of, I suppose, shadowing or giving time off from teaching to be allowed to pursue research so that they can get their publication rates back up. There's a lot of good practice examples. It's just making sure they happen. And because research is so driven by the individual PI, I suppose that's where the training and education piece is going to be really important, because no one will say that they intentionally mean to, impact or negatively impact someone's career. Everyone is supportive when someone says they're going to have a baby. But the reality is that, the opportunities are skewered because of the time commitment and what happens in that person's life. So I think there's the organisational policy level change, there's the training and education, and then there's the cultural change of people, I suppose, talking about these things differently and making it acceptable for everybody to take time with their children if they need to.